Hello and good morning. I'm Nino, founder of the news publication Electric Autonomy Canada, and I'd like to thank Ryson and the Centre for Urban Energy for inviting me to moderate this morning discussion with these great panelists. On behalf of Ryson and the Centre for Urban Energy, I'd like to thank Invest Durham for supporting this session. You can visit the team at Invest Durham during the break in their booth in the expo to learn more right after this session. The theme of this year's conference, Leading the Charge the Next 10 Years, is incredibly relevant to electric vehicles. The Government of Canada has set a target that at least 30% of all new vehicle sales be zero emission by 2030. And last year in 2020, just 3.5% of vehicles sold in Canada were EVs. So we have a mountain to climb to reach these adoption levels in the next 9-10 years, and many challenges to overcome. To help us put these issues in perspective, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. They are Laura Bryson, COO and co-founder of SWTCH Energy, Cara Clairman, President and CEO of Plug and Drive, and David W. Paterson, Vice President, Corporate and Environmental Affairs at General Motors of Canada. Welcome to all the panelists. We invite you in the audience to ask questions, and I'll put as many of them to the panel as possible. On the right of your screen, you'll see an event and a sessions tab. If you click on the sessions tab on the right-hand side, below that you'll see a Q&A tab. So if you please put your questions in there. Well, let's kick off the discussion. Now, obviously, there's no electric vehicles if there's no electricity to power them. So let's start there. Cara, could you speak to the energy landscape in Canada, clean power generation, and what the future looks like, especially in Ontario in this regard?
Sure. Thanks, Nino. And thanks so much to Ryerson and the Centre for Urban Energy for inviting me. You know, we're really fortunate in Canada for a couple of reasons. First of all, we have relatively clean electricity all across the country. In fact, about 80% of the total electricity across Canada is low to no GHG emitting. And that's because we have, we're blessed with a lot of hydro resources. And here in Ontario, for example, the bulk of our baseload generation is nuclear and hydro. And so in many provinces, the drop in emissions, if you switch from gas to electric, is enormous. It's, 90+%, in some provinces as much as 97-98%. There are some provinces with fossil fuel on the grid, but even in those provinces, like if you look at Alberta and Saskatchewan, you still get a pretty good emission reduction in the switch because, those grids aren't entirely fossil fuel based. And they're getting cleaner every year. You always have an efficiency gain because a giant coal plant is still more efficient than a small ICE engine. So, overall in every province of Canada, you see a real life cycle benefit to making the switch. So that's number one. Number two is we actually have quite a lot of surplus baseload generation in Canada. So if you take Ontario, for example, at night when everyone is turning everything off, we have quite a lot of surplus capacity on the grid. So if we just teach people to plug their cars in off peak at night by sending a price signal or some other way, we actually already have a lot of the capacity needed to plug in lots and lots of cars. And if you talk to people in the utilities sector, they'll tell you, most people could get an electric car before we even need to build more generation capacity. So we're really blessed on both fronts in terms of clean and in terms of capacity. So we're in really good shape here in Canada.
Great, thanks, Cara. And could you touch on in Ontario in particular, obviously we've got the Pickering power plant, which is due to be coming offline soon. What impact do you expect that to have in particular on Ontario's emission output, if you like?
Well, that's actually a very good point, because right now we have quite a lot of surplus baseload capacity, which means, you plug in at night, you're going to plug into mostly nuclear, hydro, and a little bit of wind. Once Pickering comes out, we will still have some surplus at night, but not nearly as much as we had. And so when we're hitting that peak demand, so take, for example, these kind of days where it's really, really hot, you know, to meet that peak demand, we're going to be running natural gas at the peak, at least that's the plan. And so the emissions will go up for everyone. And of course, that marginal rate, every additional thing we add on, you know, it's running on natural gas. So we need to do what we can actually to improve the renewable content of our grid prior to Pickering coming out, so that we can avoid using natural gas to run our electric cars.
Cara. And Laura, Cara touched on the fact that there's obviously plenty of surplus energy available to power the vehicles, but how ready are the utilities to actually deal with this increased demand? You know, since we're looking at a tenfold increase, you know, going from 3.5% adoption to 30% in 10 years. You know, what are the things in particular that you think utilities will need to be able to address to meet this increase?
For sure. Yeah. Well, as Cara mentioned, here in Ontario, we're lucky because there's a surplus of energy and it's actually being sold at a loss. So utilities should really be excited about the opportunity to have more electric vehicles charging overnight and consuming that surplus energy. But EV adoption rates vary geographically, and the need for grid upgrades and for utilities preparedness really depends on charger utilization rates and also on existing capacity. So certain neighborhoods may require upgrades sooner just because they have aging infrastructure and they can't support that load growth from EV charging. And that's where the need for managed or controlled EV charging really comes into play. In the EV industry, we refer to a term called network management, networked charging stations, where charging stations are connected to the internet for remote control, for monitoring, diagnostics, and data sharing purposes. So we get a ton of information from these charging stations about when people are charging, how long they're charging, how much energy they're consuming, and we start to get a picture of usage patterns. And that's really powerful in informing utilities' decision-making processes about when and how to upgrade.
And to what extent will utilities, so with network chargers, the utilities will be able to get information. Will they also be able to control the charging? You hear about smart charging or demand response. Could you expand on the reality and potential of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So load management is the single most powerful tool that utilities have to control charging. So the ability to turn a charging station down, to turn the output down during peak periods, or to increase it when there's excess capacity. So if you think about real estate developers that are planning putting charging into new buildings, or building owners that want to retrofit their buildings for charging infrastructure, having load management allows them to maximize their capacity and to really be able to plan for longer term for more charging stations.
Great, thanks, Laura. And just out of interest, and Laura, you may know this, or perhaps some of the other panelists, do you know how ready the consumers or public are to accept handing over the control of their charging windows to a utility or a third party, let's say? I don't know if there's been any tests or pilots that you could speak to.
Well, actually, I participated in a Toronto Hydro pilot where we did, there were about 35 EV owners who did hand their controls over, and it was a learning experience. Obviously, we were all early adopter, keener types, but where they would stop charging at certain times and then shift our charging into the night, or reduce our charging amount, but over a longer period of time. They experimented to learn, and it showed that actually that ability is there. And I think all we need to do to get consumers on board is to offer them a very attractive price. If you offer consumers an incentive to do so, they'll do so. I mean, we learned that through Peak Saver and other programs where Toronto Hydro did the same thing for air conditioners. So I'm confident people will do it as long as the price signal's there.
So Cara, let me ask you, as somebody who took part in a trial, the question is, did you wake up in the morning and aim to use your vehicle, but there was no charging it because I hadn't powered it up correctly?
No, actually, there was never a time where it impacted me. They'd mess with it during the night and sometimes shut it off and give me my 2 hours, you know, at 4 in the morning instead of at 10 p.m. And so they were just trying to show that that could all be done. And never once did I get up in the morning and not have a full charge. That the other thing they did is there was an app where I could say, okay, I need to be fully charged by X time. Let's say I leave the house at 8 and now I don't leave the house at all, but when I did, it was always ready when I needed to leave. So it shows that these systems work. And I think consumers will gain confidence once they have experience with them. I know Electra has also done a pilot with a lot more people offering a really low, super low nighttime price between certain times and a high peak price during certain times. And in that pilot, people learn to avoid the peak price and to maximize on the lowest price. And the consumer saved money and the utility also saved money because it helped it manage its load. So it shows it can be beneficial on both sides.
That's awesome. Great to hear firsthand experience. So to help this transition happen, we need quality electric cars. In a great leadership move, General Motors has pledged to stop making gasoline-powered passengers cars, vans and SUVs by 2035. So David, what proportion of GM's sales in 2030 do you expect to be EVs, and what needs to happen to help you sell more?
Well, I'd like to see over half of them, but you know, building on the conversation up to now, you know, we know we've got some real advantages in our power grid. We know we've got some advantages in terms of charging, and now we're going to depend not just on having lots of electric vehicles. They are coming in droves now. I mean, we're in General Motors, but in other companies as well. The change is on. This is the biggest technology change in automotive since we moved from horses, if you think about it. So this is a big shift. It's a big investment in technology, but as you said, we intend to have 100% of our light duty vehicles being electric by 2035. We'll have some 30 electric vehicles for sale by 2030. So this is a pretty rapid shift that's taking place. But what that means is all of us consumers to now get with this. We've got the charging, we've got the really the great grid in Canada, but people have to get comfortable making the switch, and not all of us buy a new car every year. So it's going to take a period of time for people to make that change, and it's got to be attractive to them. And just as we've talked about with charging in the transition, one of the ways to do that is to help people with the purchase of a vehicle. In the United States, we have a bill in front of Congress that is looking at providing new EV purchasers with $7,500 US and an additional $2,500 if it's made in the United States, and an additional $2,500 if it's made with union labor. So these are very big incentives that are being talked about in the United States. Canada has $5,000 across the country, but that's not what I just talked about. We also have huge investments coming in our charging network in the United States. And Canada has some, but we need to really pull up our socks and make sure that we're getting the investment in the charging network and that we have some good incentives to help people to make the switch. We'll deliver the vehicles. The vehicles are going to be there and they're going to be awesome. I think people are going to love driving electric vehicles. They're going to love the experience of being able to get up in the morning with a full tank and off you go. Except it's going to be full of electrons with some incredible batteries. And just one other add to some of the things that we just talked about is that those vehicles and the new battery systems, they can be part of that solution as well, and that you're going to be able to plug your house into your car to help run some of the things in your house to manage your peak load as well. So there's all kinds of technology change that we're only scraping the surface of that will make electric vehicles better and better And I'm sure by 2030, we're going to be saying, what were we doing with those old gasoline versions that we had before? So it's exciting. And we can't wait to get some of the new ones on the road of all sizes, ranging from pickup trucks down to smaller vehicles, because Canadians don't want to compromise the size of the vehicles they have. They want to have an electric option everywhere, and we will deliver that.
Awesome. Thanks, David. I mean, just to clarify the point that you mentioned there on the incentives. So in the US, the proposition right now, so it's not law, it's not a policy, but the proposition that's going forward is, if I added up correctly, $12,500 in total with all those incentives, $7,500 plus if it's made in the US, $2,500, and plus if it's unionized, it's another $2,500. It could be the total incentive package that they would be offering.
That's the proposal that is in front of Congress. And so, there's a very integrated automobile industry since the 1960s. I would like to make sure that we make a lot of these electric vehicles here in Canada. We're going to be doing that at General Motors. And we'll probably be the first of the major automakers to convert our Ingersoll plant to making an all-electric, actually a cargo van, which will actually have some other very interesting benefits for companies like FedEx, that now we see packages arriving at our door at a more frequent rate. We have an electric vehicle that will allow people to not only go green in the delivery of all those packages, but we have a made in Canada technology system that is going to help them improve the efficiency of that delivery by up to 30%, which is quite revolutionary in the delivery business as well. So technologies are coming together to be able to do things better with electricity. And we want to make sure that if the vehicle happens to be made here in Canada, that a good consumer in the United States might be able to buy it and take advantage of it. And if a vehicle is made in the United States and we want to sell it here in Canada, that our Canadian consumers are not at a disadvantage against the Americans in terms of being able to get the assistance that they need to really make that switch. Whether it's their first vehicle, maybe it's one that's in the driveway and doing all your city driving, or if it's that pickup truck that you need to do real work, you may need a little help in the next little while, because at the moment electric vehicles are a little bit more expensive than internal combustion engines. And so making that transition is going to be a partnership with government one way or the other. And we are still working through how we make sure that we do that as efficiently as possible.
I think it's tremendously exciting that I think it's the EV600, the delivery van, is going to be made here in Ontario, and with the increase in obviously home deliveries, we really need these low emission last mile vehicles, which is terrific. Cara, just building on David's point about the point for incentives. Obviously, in addition to GM making an electrified vehicle here, Ford and Stellantis have committed to make them in Ontario too. But right now, we don't currently have a provincial incentive, unlike BC and Quebec. And I just wondered if you could kind of speak to the implications of that. Obviously, you're working very closely with the public, and you hear firsthand the importance of you hear the concerns that people bring to you. Could you just speak to that point on price parity and really the impact that incentives have?
Well, sure. I mean, look, we know incentives work because you just have to look at what happened when Ontario took the incentive away. Sales really dropped precipitously. We've seen a boom in sales in Quebec and BC where there are incentives and also ZEV mandates. And Ontario right now has got trouble just actually attracting the vehicles here. Not for every brand. There's some brands with good availability, but there are some brands that are really completely unavailable because they were all sent to the jurisdictions that have incentives where they're more likely to sell. And so there's sort of a double whammy of you don't have that incentive to buy and it's hard to find the vehicles. So we've suffered here in Ontario because of it. Now, it's not for lack of interest, because certainly as someone who deals with the public all the time, I hear people saying, how come we haven't sold more here in Ontario? It's like, well, we sell what we have pretty much. We just don't have enough. And I think it's important too to remember we're competing with the whole world. And if you look at the policies of a California, for example, I mean, you can understand an automaker has to make decisions of 2 years ahead of how, you know, how many vehicles they're going to provide to different jurisdictions. And Canada just didn't look that interested in EVs. And so we have to send a signal to those companies, hey, we're a willing market. We want those cars. And so there's a lot we need to do to attract them. I agree with David that incentives, they help. You know, there is going to be a point at which we're going to hit price parity. Some people are saying it's as soon as 2025. You know, one of the ideas that we've floated and, you know, I think would work well is a sort of a declining incentive over years, which would send a signal, you know, that we are going to get to that point where incentives aren't needed. It would also inspire people to kind of hurry it up. If the incentive dropped by a certain amount every year. So for example, if you had a $10,000 incentive in 2021, but then it went down to 8 and then 6 and then 4 over a period of 4 to 6 years, by then, you know, we'll be, I think, out of the need for incentives. And also we'll see a lot more makes and models, as David said, which also helps too. I mean, the other challenge we've had is just we've had a limited number of makes and models available. By this time next year, we're expecting almost 100 different makes and models available if all the vehicles proposed actually come to pass. So that's pretty exciting. We've got about 40 right now, 42. So a huge increase in options for people, that's going to help. And of course, as we've all discussed, we really need to educate people, help them understand the benefits, because there's still plenty of people who've never had the opportunity to drive one and learn about one and understand that they're going to save money over time. They're going to reduce emissions. They're going to have a quieter, more fun ride. And it's going to be more convenient because they're going to charge it up at home overnight. They're not going to have to go get gas or fill up with something on the road. So I think there's plenty of work to do, but you're right. I mean, incentives are a piece of the puzzle, and we do have to encourage our governments to look at those.
And Cara, and the panel, what's the role of the used EV marketplace, would you say, in helping the transition?
Well, I'm happy to kick that off and then let others. I mean, obviously, used is more affordable and widely available right now. I mean, if there's a brand that you're looking for that you can't find new, used is a great option. We did a survey a couple of years ago asking people what their concerns were, what the barriers are. And the number one barrier was price, not range, not, you know, availability of public charging, none of these. It was price by a mile. And so we have to help people see that actually they pay up front to save later. And if, you know, the incentive would help with that. Maybe creative leasing could help with that. But we have to show used as a great option for people who can't afford a new car, never buy a new car, that they can get into the EV market as well.
One thing I can add to what Cara is saying, because I agree with everything she's saying, is that as an automaker, I hate these incentives and the fact that we have to have incentives. I don't want to have a product sold with incentives. It's the last thing I want. But there is a technology transition that is taking place where the cost of electric vehicle batteries are the driver of a higher price. So generally, if a new electric vehicle in the same size as an internal combustion engine vehicle is on the market, there is a gap there. There's a price gap, and it's almost entirely driven by the cost of batteries, which are generally imported from Asia for most car companies, although our company is making a very large set of investments in battery plants here in North America. And the technology change in those batteries is what is going to bring down the cost of the vehicles more than anything else. And that's the horizon that Cara talks about in terms of getting to price parity. Boy, is that exciting as an automaker to be able to then be able to offer the same range of vehicles that we offer today and be able to do it not just at price parity. How about less expensive? If we can use technology to bring down the battery costs over the next 5 to 10 years, then we won't need the incentives. And then we will be very competitive in the marketplace against each other to sell our electric vehicles. And so I think that's the trajectory that we're on. The electric vehicles are coming. The investments by the automakers in batteries and battery cell technology is huge, billions and billions right now, because it's a competitive game to make sure that we get that offering. And then the other thing I would mention too is that we tend to have a bit of an understanding about electric vehicles based on where we live. And so if we experience electric vehicles in the city, they will tend to be smaller vehicles that get us around in the city. But most Canadians are not all Canadians live in the city. And a lot of people need larger vehicles, either in the suburbs or certainly in the country. And so, to give you a sample, some 30 to 40% of the vehicles that we sell at General Motors are pickup trucks. That's what the market wants. And so to be able to deliver a pickup truck that is fully electric, and we're doing that, we'll have one coming out later this year. And I think very appropriately, it is the Hummer brand that will lead the all-electric assault on the pickup market. But we'll have Chevrolets and others that will come out in that market. We'll have very big batteries to be able to pull the loads that we need and aspects like that. So the cost factor is really important. Batteries is the whole game. And the industry will take care of itself in terms of getting that done. Now we need charging to be in place so that people can travel as they need. And we need to make sure that we get the transition funded with incentives.
Fantastic. We've got so many topics to dive into there from the discussion. So I'm really hoping to get into as many of them as possible. Laura, vehicle to grid, David just touched on the potential for a vehicle to be able to power a home or to support auxiliary power if an external load is required. I just wondered if you could kind of touch on the reality of that and how close are we to being able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is it's going to take time because you need not only the charging stations to be vehicle to grid capable, and there's very few commercially available vehicle to grid hardware available. You also need the charging stations to be able, the vehicles to be able to support that. And right now, the Nissan Leaf is one of the only EVs commercially available on the market that can support vehicle to grid. So I think it comes back to the evolution in technology and being able to support that, but also to Cara's point about education and helping the public understand the benefits of that type of technology to be willing to participate in programs that take advantage of vehicle to grid.
Laura, so limited charging infrastructure is sometimes cited as a barrier to EV adoption. At the same time, as has been alluded by the panelists, a lot of charging is done at home, and the number you often hear is 80 to 90%. Laura, could you chat through the different types of charging and why charging at home is a problem for some people and how we can help solve that?
Sure, yeah, there's really three main types of charging. There's level 1, which is just like your regular home outlet. You can technically charge a battery electric vehicle on a home outlet. I did it going to Killarney a few years ago, and I was backcountry camping for 3 days. When I came back, the vehicle was fully charged, but it did take 3 days from completely empty to full. So it's not very practical. Level 2 is really the sweet spot for home and workplace charging because your vehicle stays parked for a long period of time, whether it's overnight while you're sleeping or during the day while you're at work. But also in terms of the electrical infrastructure requirements to support that, it's a 208, 240 volt circuit, which is like your dryer plugs. So it's much easier to get that into these multifamily and commercial buildings. And then the third level being DC fast charging, which supports long distance journeys. So people that need to top up quickly while they're completing their long distance journey. And you see those along the highway or in other commercial and retail settings. But to your question about the challenge of home charging, early adopters of electric vehicles tended to live in single family homes where it was easier to get a charger into their own car garage. They don't need any permission. They're their landlord and they install it. There may be some cost if they don't have a lot of capacity, but the challenge really comes in for these multifamily buildings, newer adopters of electric vehicles that live and work in high density urban environments in these high-rise condos and office towers. And it's more difficult to get EV charging in there, partly because of the costs associated with retrofitting and adding in electrical infrastructure, and also the permissions that are required from condo boards or from the property owners to make those types of renovations. So again, going back to the load management, I think that's really the most powerful tool that these real estate developers and property owners have to support the installation of charging infrastructure, because they can get more chargers in at lower cost.
Thanks, Laura. And I think while we're on the topic, it'd be good to take a question from Hong Song, who's asking for residential chargers, and Cara's maybe something, or David maybe able to help with, for residential charger, usually level 2 AC charger, what the utility should do to extend its load regulation into that residential charger.
Well, for residential, most of us are plugging in at night, right? So that's the typical time. That's when you're home. And that's, at least here in Ontario, we've had time of use pricing. We've had flat pricing during the pandemic, but for the most part, we've had time of use pricing. So it encourages us to plug in at night. And so most of us will do so. And in fact, these cars are so smart, your charger doesn't even have to be very smart, because they all come with apps, and you can set your time to charge, at midnight or whatever times, to make sure that you take advantage of the nighttime surplus and also the lowest price, which also happens to be the lowest emitting time to charge. So sort of the sweet spot all around. And so I would say, there we don't really need anything more than what we have. What I think we could use is more aggressive time of use pricing in this province. There's a little bit of a hesitation around time of use pricing for some reason here. Personally, I think a way around that is to give an opt-in aggressive time of use price. So for example, I could choose to opt in to a super low nighttime price and a super high peak price. And I would learn to avoid the peak and take advantage of the super low nighttime. The utility will save money. This is what the Electra study showed. The utility will save money, and so will I. And so why not make that available to anyone who wants it? That way, those folks who, for example, prefer a flat price because they tend to be home during the day, and they, that's true for retired people or certain people that work from home or whatever. If you don't want that kind of pricing structure, you don't have to have it. So to me, that's a great solution, and something we could, I think, argue for with this provincial government. It's something that benefits everyone, I think.
Give you a funny extension on that. I'm working on the conversion of our Ingersoll plant to be able to produce the all-electric bright drop vehicles that are coming up. And one of the things that we're looking at doing, and working with the Ontario government on this, is to put some very significant industrial batteries into the plant to do just what Cara talked about, so that we can fill up at night when there's a lower cost electricity and run it during peak. And just that addition of industrial batteries, because we're in the battery business now, is the difference between Ontario having an industrial rate that is uncompetitive today, still about at least 10% higher than our neighboring jurisdictions, which also would like to be producing our vehicles. We do this and we'll be lower. So we'll be more competitive as an industrial base than Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and we'll do that by simply installing smart batteries.
Awesome. Yeah, David, so it'd be good to just dive a little further into batteries that you've just pulled on there, and your comment earlier about the fact that the sooner we can get battery prices down, the sooner it's going to have an impact on cost. And making battery cells in Canada is something that's very close to our hearts at Electric Autonomy in terms of building a supply chain here. And you've explained to me that a large, if we are to manufacture cells here in Canada, any factory would need to be able to service a number of car manufacturers to sell those batteries to a number of car manufacturers. What would need to happen for Canada to actually have a factory here that manufactures battery cells at scale?
Well, I think what's happening in the electric vehicle business is that the large producers, the OEMs as we call them, of electric vehicles like General Motors, are owning their own cell making capability. As we say, we own our own chemistry. We actually have a joint venture partnership with one of the Asian experts in large battery development, which is LG. There's a handful, half a dozen major Asian-based cell manufacturing companies: Panasonic, LG, SKI out of Korea, Japan, places like that. And they've sourced the minerals for those batteries, largely for the China market, out of Asia. We're not set up in North America with the small amount of EVs that are being sold at this point, but that's about to change with that type of local sourcing. So we need to change that. And so we have 2 $3 billion battery plants under construction right now, and more to come. But in the scale of a company like General Motors that has many auto plants across North America, battery plants will be somewhat like engine plants are today. So an engine plant, we have one in St. Catharines, will serve about a dozen different car manufacturing plants, and that's just scale. They'll make 100,000 engines, and they'll deliver those to car manufacturing plants. So we have 2 major battery plants that will serve our variety of different auto plants that will make electric vehicles. So what we'll see, I think, is that the battery plants will be owned by the OEMs, and they will follow the manufacturing factories at scale, so that you won't have a battery plant in every auto factory. You will have an owned battery production facility that'll serve, say, a dozen of your auto plants that make electric vehicles. So once you have the scale of sales to generate the scale of auto plants making electric vehicles, battery plants will follow. We will need to transfer the technology to be able to make electric vehicle batteries to North America. That's why the partnerships are taking place, like we have with LG. And then we're going to need to change the engines in flight. In other words, we're going to need to not just make electric batteries, we're going to need to make them better with more energy density capability, and we're going to need to make them so that they're more affordable. And that's the R&D. It's not just like big screen TVs, where the more you make of them, the lower the price. I wish it was that way, but it won't be. It's actually a technology breakthrough in changing the different mineral mixes in the battery so that you can reduce the cost and make the battery something that will drive someone. It would be nice to have a battery that takes you 1,000 kilometers and takes less time to charge. That's what we'll move towards, but it's going to take technology. And that's why battery development is the core of the success of the move to electric vehicles.
Thanks, David. One of the questions from Marcia Hon: how do you deal with range anxiety? So be interested in Laura and Cara, what's your view about range anxiety these days? Laura, maybe you want to take that one.
Sure, I'll try. I mean,
thanks, Cara.
Honestly, I think range anxiety is one of those things that you have until you have an electric vehicle, and then you realize you don't have any reason to have range anxiety anymore. So I think most EV owners you'll talk to is that they might have had range anxiety for the first couple of weeks that they had their EV, and then they just got used to it. And I think to give people confidence, I think because EV chargers tend to be small and they tend to be behind buildings or under buildings, they're not that visible to people. And so, of course, us EV owners, we have the apps that show us where they are, and we see, wow, they're everywhere. Whereas I think a lot of other people who've not yet joined the EV crowd will say like, wow, I mean, I would love an EV, but there aren't any chargers anywhere. And it's almost like, look and ye shall find, because it's like you really just have to know where to find them. And these apps do a great job of showing you where they are. And many of the car GPSs will also tell you where they are. And so these issues around range anxiety are more a perception, in my view, than real. And it's quite easy to get around with an EV. I've taken an EV from Toronto to Detroit, Toronto to Montreal, Toronto to New York City. And it's no problem. You just plan your route. It can be a little more challenging in the middle of winter when your range is less, and you just have to plan better. So it just requires some pre-thinking. And I actually think this is why our insurance rates for EV owners are going to go down, because, EV owners tend to plan their routes and tend not to speed because they want to preserve range. And so for those reasons, the actuaries will catch on that, wow, like these folks are safer drivers, so they're gonna give us better insurance rates.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Cara. And I think to David's point about the evolution of the battery, I mean, as these batteries, the technology improves, range will improve, and you'll still want to know where all your most reliable charging stations are, but there'll be less need for that. You'll be charging them less just because the range is higher. And from what we've seen from data from SWTCH's charging station users in condominiums and apartment buildings, people aren't charging every single day. But again, it really depends on the user's particular driving patterns. But yeah, I think the other piece of this that sort of ties into another question that someone had about the DC fast charging infrastructure and how that will be implemented. I think having a really robust public network of DC fast charging infrastructure will go a long way in eliminating range anxiety, because as long as you have it available, even if you don't need to make use of it, knowing that it's there when you're out and about, that's really key.
The one thing I would add is, as somebody that is really wanting to see people embrace these electric vehicles very quickly so that our business plan works and all this investment we're making, I am concerned that we need to have more visible and a lot more charging in Canada. If you study this in Canada versus the United States, we are behind. If you are traveling on the major series highways, it's fine if you as Cara says, you will have an app and the app will help you find charging. But if you're pulling into some place that doesn't allow you to buy a few hamburgers while you're waiting, you might find the experience is different than filling up your car. So we can improve, and the technology will help us improve in this area. We cannot back off the investment in Canada in our charging network, just as we need to continue to help people to make the shift financially. Because the one thing about electric cars is that we can produce them, but our dealers have to sell them. And it's a consumer product. And so we have to build that confidence. And when you do polling of Canadians, and I've done some in the last 2 weeks, it is absolutely the case that, number one, they're worried about the cost and making sure they make the transition in cost. And they're wanting to know that charging is going to be available to them. They probably don't know that 90% of charging is at home, but that will take care of most people's needs in the city. But those of us that travel, as Cara says, in the winter, they want to have a good, visible, strong charging network, and they want to be able to fill up quickly. So we have work to do in this area, and we can't back off.
100%. I just like to add, I totally agree, David. I think, if you look on any of the apps like Charge Hub or any of them, that it looks like there's chargers everywhere, and there is if you live in sort of southwestern Ontario or sort of urbanized areas. There's a question from James on the chat that in rural it's harder, and that's true. There's less. It's growing, but there's definitely less visible. again, you know, it's important for people to think about what do they do on a routine basis? How far do they go? Most of us actually don't drive that far. It's the one-off road trip that tends to get people concerned. And you have to think, okay, if I do that once or twice a year, should I change which car I buy for those 1 or 2 trips a year? Sometimes if you're really going to do a remote trip, it might make sense just to take a different car. This car might suit 99% of your needs and not the 1%. Let's hope we can get to where it can do everything. But certainly for me, like, I used to have to rent a van once a year, you know, to do a certain trip. That's okay. So I just think it's important also to think about how you use your car and not to feel like this one car has to do every single trip that you do, because most Canadians, the stats tell you that most of us drive 50 kilometers or less a day. So rural, urban, it's actually not much different. And so you just have to actually look at your personal driving and see what you need, rather than thinking like, oh, I live rural, so I can't do it.
Thanks, Cara. So the questions are coming in at pace, and Laura, if I can, a couple related to V2G. So Laura, if I can just put the first one to you, and then a follow-up to David, and obviously Cara as well. Laura, first of all, if there's no price difference or time of use locations with a flat energy rate, for example, can a vehicle-to-grid program be economically feasible for the EV owners, given the degradation of the batteries? And then David, perhaps you could follow on after that with, you mentioned using pickup trucks for backup power. Will GM's upcoming EV support V2G or vehicle to home? What gaps do you see in enabling consumers to embrace the technology? So Laura, if you could just take that first.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question and a tough one, because I think we're still learning about the battery degradation and the impact on the battery overall, like the lifetime of the battery. So I think it's still TBD in terms of that impact. I would add that there's more of an impact when it's DC fast charging, but depending on whether the program's utilizing level 2 or DC fast charging, then you may need to be more careful with the battery degradation component for DC fast charging.
So I can throw in just on our experience. I mean, we started introducing electric vehicles with the Chevrolet Volt over a decade ago, and then about 5 years ago, GM was first in the market with a vehicle that would have 400 kilometers of range and start to address that really practical range that allows you to go to the cottage or drive to Ottawa or whatever it is that you need to do. So 400 sort of became a benchmark number. There's a handful of other companies that now have small vehicles with that range. Others have sort of plug-in hybrid vehicles that are not getting that same kind of range. But I think going forward, you know, all electric vehicles are going to need to be full battery electric vehicles that have a minimum of 400 kilometers of range, and then we'll go up from that, is my view anyway. Our experience with the batteries is that, first of all, there are no, other than the very rare instance of some kind of a dealer repair, which is almost never, our batteries are all still on the road for a decade. And there's almost no recycling of batteries at this point, because they're all still being driven. They're in the secondhand market or they're on the road. They last a long. Massive battery testing plants where we can simulate the life of a battery through extreme cold, through extreme hot. The head of our battery lab said to me, David, you know, batteries are like people. They like to be at around 20 degrees. You know, what our car systems do is batteries so that we can get more range out of the battery. And even after a decade of use, you're probably still at 70 to 80% use in that battery is what we're finding. We'll have secondary uses. I mentioned our factories. And even at the Pan Am Games a number of years ago, we demonstrated how our Chevrolet Volt batteries in series could be used to power a house. So there's going to be lots of uses for the cells. Are going to get better, and the technology and the chemistry is going to change and develop. And we'll need to figure out sort of recycling mechanisms. I think some jurisdictions are sort of jumping to the excitement of let's have a cycling system. I think you're going to find the auto companies are going to want to take back because we have uses for them as well. You may even find models coming forward where the car maker leases you the battery because they're going to own it and take it back. So we're just at the beginning of technology changes and marketing changes. And in the car business, we know a thing or two about that. The ability to plug your house in from your car is going to be another thing that will be very competitive in the market. So people are asking, you know, is that going to be coming in our vehicles? I can't make announcements today, but I think you're going to find there's going to be a lot of very cool things that are going to make the car a mobile generator for many things in your life.
Exciting times ahead, and lots of information on the way. We are unfortunately out of time, and I'm sorry for the questions that we haven't been able to get to because we had some great questions coming in. I would like to thank the panelists for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us today. It's been a terrific discussion. And I'd like to thank Ryerson and the Centre for Urban Energy for hosting this conversation and putting on this conference. Big thanks to the audience for tuning in to us today. And again, thank you for the questions. There is a short break now in which you can check out the virtual booths or network with other attendees via the People tab. The next panel session, What's in Store for Energy Storage, starts at 10:15, so you've got a few minutes to go and grab yourself a coffee, but make sure you don't miss that one. So thanks very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Nino.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.